Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Breadwinner Podcast. It's Caroline here, and I'm just so excited to be here and get to talk all things sourdough microbakery with you once again. Today's episode is one that I've seen a need for a really long time, and I've gone back and forth on how best to approach it to make it super valuable, but also it is a little bit outside of my specific area of expertise. And so I'm presenting it as this is what I've learned, but not as this is the only way to do it. So today's topic is about baking in bulk. And this is what I see. So everyone goes through it. It is the learning curve that has to happen when you go from baking 1 or 2 loaves at a time to baking 6, 8, 20, 30, and on up from there. And while I'm not here to teach you how to bake, you won't see tutorials on how to bake on my social media, on my podcast, because there are other people who do that so well. And I love to defer to experts on that. What I do want to do is share what I've learned and try to answer some of the most common questions and some of the most common issues that I see when people are figuring out how to scale up their bakes. So there are as many ways to bake as there are bakers. I am just one of many. All that said, don't take what I share as gospel. If you learn something from someone else that works better from you, just take what serves you and leave the rest. I will say I am a very intuitive baker. I am not super scientific. I don't take the temperature of my dough. I just have learned to read my dough and go from there. And so that's kind of part of why I've hesitated a little bit to share much about the how-to of baking up until now, because I do not have a formulaic answer for you that you can just go and apply and take your temperature and measure your time and have a perfect result. My method is more, I read my dough, I know how it needs to feel, I know how to adjust based on temperature, humidity, types of flour, amount of starter, things like that. And that comfort, that confidence, that intuition has been developed over time. I started out by using the beginner's recipe in The Perfect Loaf by Maurizio Leo, and I baked that probably 6 or 8 times, that same recipe, over and over, following his process to the word, and that is what helped everything click for me. With that understanding, I knew the way my dough needed to feel, and then I could go and adjust the hydration, and I could play with different flours, and I could scale it up because I knew what I was looking for, and I could replicate it with other factors. So with that slightly lengthy introduction, I am going to share, hopefully as briefly and as understandably as possible, some of the things that I've learned about baking in bulk. Before we jump into today's topic, this is a very time-sensitive little note about the Breadwinner Inner Circle. This is my small group coaching program. It's a 12-week program where we come together weekly in a group and we go deep on the 6 pillars that I've identified that help you grow a thriving business. So we're going to be talking about sales, marketing, cash flow, product optimization, process optimization, and lifestyle optimization. Those are the 6 things that I have found we need all of those to make sure that our business is burnout proof. And we spend 2 weeks per topic exploring them and helping hone our business, hone our processes, tweak our menu, and just make sure that we are building a business that is made to last. We do this in a group, and we have a private Facebook group for community and accountability and question asking, and it is just a wonderful experience. My very first cohort wrapped up just a couple weeks ago, and I am so excited to lead the next group of participants through the inner circle. We're going to kick off the first week of February, and enrollment for this next group closes on January 31st, so it's coming really soon. If you are ready to invest in the growth of your business and you want to do it in community with accountability and structure, the Breadwinner Inner Circle is for you. There's a link down in the show notes if you need more information, or if you're just ready to go ahead and sign up, the link in the show notes is ready for you, and I cannot wait to get to know you deeper in the inner circle. All right, with that said, let's get started talking all about bulk baking. We're going to start with starter. And one of the First things I learned is that you do not need to keep and maintain a huge amount of starter. I think so many of us go through this learning curve where we first get started and we have our mason jar of starter, and then we have to discard and we start another mason jar, and then before we know it, we have 7 mason jars full of starter. And that's part of the learning curve of understanding that doesn't need to be part of the process. So I'm going to walk you through what my process with starter looks like. And again, take what serves you, leave the rest. There are a lot of ways to do this, but this is how I maintain my starter and then bulk it up to get ready for a big bake day. So I always have 2 containers. I don't have props because I'm out in the garage recording studio because the family's inside. But I have a small container number 1 and then a slightly larger container number 2. Container number 1 is 1 quart, container number 2 is 4 quarts. Number 1 is where I keep about 30 to 50 grams of active starter at room temperature throughout the week. Number 2 is where I keep my cold discard in the fridge for discard recipes, cookies, crackers, muffins, things like that. So here's my process preparing for a Wednesday dough day. On Sunday, I scrape the majority of the starter out of container 1, the active starter, into container number 2, leaving me with about 5 to 10 grams of starter. I scrape out the whole container pretty much and just leave whatever's left clinging to the edge. Whatever's left in that container number 1, I feed a ratio of about 1 to 5, sometimes higher. So it might be about 5 grams of starter with 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water. On Monday is the day when you determine the amount of starter that you're going to need for your bulk batch. And this process assumes a Wednesday dough day, so adjust as needed if your timing is different. This process is all going to be written out on my website too, on the episode show notes, so you can go to carolinebauer.com/episode 55 to see this all written out. When you're determining the amount of starter that you'll need for your bulk batch, for this example, let's say that you're baking 10 loaves and you're going to need 1,000 grams of starter. I have a spreadsheet that I use for this. I keep all of my recipes on the spreadsheet with all of the ingredients and the grams needed for each recipe. And then the spreadsheet has a column where I can multiply my ingredient, where I can indicate the number of batches I want to make, and it multiplies the ingredients for me. So for example, my original sourdough calls for, in a recipe that makes 2 loaves, it calls for 1,000 grams of flour, 200 grams of starter, and if I want to make 10 loaves, then I would put a 5 in the batches cell, and it automatically multiplies everything to give me what I need to make 5 batches of my 2 loaf recipe, resulting in 10 loaves, and it tells me how much starter I need. So in this example, I would need 1,000 grams of starter. This is super helpful. I put all of my recipes in there. It's a fairly simple spreadsheet to make, just kind of basic calculations, super easy to replicate. If you're not a spreadsheet person or you don't want to take the time to do it, I actually went ahead and made a version that you can purchase and copy, and you can organize all your recipes in there and just keep it for yourself so you can multiply your batches really easily. I'll link that down in the show notes if you want to grab my spreadsheet for yourself. But if you're numbers inclined and a natural with Google Sheets or Excel, it's really easy to do yourself too. All right, circling on back. So we're on Monday. We determined that we need 1,000 grams of starter to bake 10 loaves. So on Tuesday, we have 100 grams of active starter that we fed on Monday. So we're going to move that into a larger container. I like the 4 quart Cambros when I'm prepping around 1,000 grams or so. So for 1,000 grams of starter, we're going to feed that 100 grams from Monday with about 450 flour and 450 water. So we will end up with just over 1,000 grams of active starter ready to bake with. Scale that as needed. So if you need 2,000 grams of starter, you can feed your 100 grams with 1,000 grams of You can feed your 100 grams of active starter with 1,000 grams of water and 1,000 grams of flour, and you're going to end up with just over 2,000 grams of active starter ready to bake for your dough day. I have found that I don't notice a a super significant increase in the amount of time that it takes for my starter to peak when I'm feeding it with a 1-to-5 ratio versus a 1-to-10 ratio. So if that's a question in your mind, if you think you need to budget enough time, play with it yourself. But I have found that if I feed my starter the evening before with even a really high ratio, it generally takes somewhere around 12, 16 hours if my house is really cold, but about 12 hours to peak and be ready to bake with. All right, so we have fed our small amount of active starter with a large amount of flour and water to bulk up our starter and prepare for dough day. That brings us to Wednesday, dough day. This is when you're going to bake with all of that active starter, but keep just a small amount in your container. You should be left with somewhere around 100 to 50 grams, around 50 to 100 grams. Scrape what you need to into your container number 2 in the fridge where you're keeping your discard, and leave what's ever left clinging to the sides to feed in your small countertop container number 1. Go on back to the initial process where you're feeding that little bit with about a 1-to-5 or 1-to-10 ratio and maintaining a super active, healthy, balanced starter on the counter, and then just rinse and repeat. You can use that process over and over to keep a really happy starter. Now, there are times where I just stick that whole thing in the fridge if it's going to be a few days before I bake, or if I won't be home. I have found that it does just fine. As long as it's getting fairly regular, high ratio feeds, it stays super healthy if I pop it in the fridge and then just pull it out and feed it once before the day that I need to bulk it up. In my experience, talking about starter is never super cut and dry. It always leads to some confusion. So hopefully that explanation was easy enough to follow. Again, you can look at the episode webpage to see it all written out. But again, use the process that feels most natural to you. It doesn't have to be the one that I'm sharing. Okay, the next thing, moving on from starter, is talking about scaling recipes. This is something that I hear questions about, and it's a very natural question to ask. But people wonder if when you are scaling your bread recipe or any recipe, if you need to adjust it when you're baking in larger quantities. And for bread especially, it's just straight multiplication for a bread recipe. So if your basic recipe calls for 1,000 grams of flour to make 2 loaves, and you need to make 30 loaves, you just use 30,000 grams of flour. Same with all the other ingredients with bread. Now, I'm not a food science expert, so I won't speak to other things like muffins. I have had great success multiplying things like muffins and cookies, but if you're not sure, maybe start with smaller batches before you go make 30. The next thing I'm going to talk about is mixing dough. I've tried a lot of different methods here, and there's a lot of ways that people do it. The one thing I've never used is a Danish whisk, so I can't speak to that. But some of the most common methods are to mix your dough by hand in a bin or to use a mixer. When you're mixing by hand, wetting your hands helps tremendously, especially when they get all gummed up. I always have a quart of water next to me, and I just stick my hand in there when it gets all gummed up and then keep working the dough, and it helps get a lot of that gooey dough off. If you are scaling up and you're mixing by hand in bowls, I would say one of the very first things that I recommend is using bins instead of bowls, so you can mix up 6 loaves in a bin instead of 6 loaves in 3 separate bowls. It's just going to cut down the number of times that you're touching the process. It's going to cut down on the amount that you're spreading all over the counter space, and it just simplifies. Bins are not super expensive, and they are one of the kind of low dollar investments that I recommend to get started. It was one of the very first things that I purchased, and it made a huge difference in my process versus using multiple bowls. The other most common way to mix is using a mixer. There are a lot of different options. A KitchenAid is not a great mixer for bread dough. It'll burn out the motor pretty fast. It's just doesn't have the strength that bread dough demands, especially when you're mixing up larger batches. Some of the strong, smaller mixers are brands like Bosch or Ankerstrom. They're great machines. They can do about 6 loaves at a time usually, and fantastic. They work great for bread dough. They are strong. They're tanks. If you don't see your business growing to the scale where you're doing 30 plus loaves a day, then sticking with a smaller mixer like a Bosch or an Anchor Shroom is going to meet your needs really well. The larger mixer option is what a lot of microbakers use when they're baking at a larger scale, when they're beyond 30 loaves a day and going up to 50, 60, 100. And a lot of those bakers will use the 30-quart Estella mixer, which is a spiral mixer, so it treats the dough very gently and does a great job. That's what I use, what you'll see with a lot of other sourdough microbakers. That just simplifies because you do not have to have your hands in the dough mixing up 24 loaves worth of really heavy dough, which is the capacity of the Estella. And if you see yourself scaling to that level, I really highly recommend the Estella. There's a lot of opinions and you can do your own research and see what works well for you. But sticking with mixing by hand is a great way to get started. Along the lines of mixing, one of the things that I get asked about a lot is inclusions and when to add those. My recommendation, and what you'll see with a lot of other bakers, is adding small inclusions like seeds during the mixing, but anything larger usually works best to add during the coil folds. So I like to just sprinkle them on the surface of the dough, usually right after my first round of coil folds, and then just fold the inclusions into the dough at that point. The only thing that I don't add during coil folds is anything with cinnamon or sugar, because cinnamon slows down the fermentation and sugar just turns into a liquidy mess. So I add cinnamon and sugar during lamination when I'm shaping my dough. I pre-shape and then let the gluten relax enough that I can straighten it out into a rectangle and sprinkle my cinnamon and sugar on at that point. This is also what I do for like blueberry lemon, because the sugar with the lemon tends to just turn really liquidy if I add it too early. Once you've got your starter bulked up and you've mixed up your dough, the next thing to talk about is proofing. Proofing is definitely probably the biggest part of the learning curve, and it takes just a lot of reps and a really deep understanding of fermentation and how your dough is going to react to different factors, including temperature, flour, hydration, all of those things. And so this is where, going back to the very beginning, I really recommend sticking with a beginner's recipe. If you're still getting the hang of fermentation in general and your loaves aren't all coming out super consistent, then go ahead and stay in that season a little bit longer until you can produce really consistent results baking just 1 or 2 loaves at a time. When you feel really comfortable baking a small amount and they all come out more or less the same, you're not underproofing or overproofing or wildly different from one batch to the next, that's when you can start to practice in bulk. I don't recommend moving up to bulk when your results are still pretty inconsistent. I see this fairly often when I'm watching bakers on Facebook. They are just getting excited, getting the hang of it, still maybe a little inconsistent and not a great understanding of fermentation. And so they start offering loaves to friends and family or offering loaves online. And that's when they realize that larger batches of dough behave a lot differently than smaller batches of dough. And they promise bread to a bunch of people and find that it's either that oftentimes it's just vastly overproofed, very flat, and they have to go back to the drawing board. So you can skip part of this learning curve just by learning from what other people have gone through and spending a little bit of time honing your own bulk baking game before you go and offer the loaves for sale. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the most common issues that I see when people are proofing their dough in bulk. The very first thing is that bulk dough rises a lot faster than smaller batches. The fermentation produces some of its own heat, and that larger mass of dough is going to hold on to that heat more, and so it just rises a lot faster. There are some really fantastic charts available by Sourdough Journey, by Hannah Guzman, Crusty Cravings by Hannah, where you can gauge the timing of how much your dough will need to rise based on the temperature. These are great, but they're specifically created for smaller batches, for batches of 1 or 2 loaves. So when you try to apply those timings and percentages to a bulk batch, it's not going to work perfectly because bulk dough behaves differently. you'll need to adjust accordingly. So this is where you really need to watch the dough and not the clock. A lot of times beginner bakers will be watching their time and they're looking at the dough and saying, well, this kind of it really looks like it's ready, but the time, it says it needs 2 hours. So the time must be right because experts said this. And yes and no, the experts said that, and it's true with a small batch, but that larger batch is really going to rise a lot faster. So again, going back to the very beginning, when you know how your dough should feel after those reps of the beginner recipe, then you can be a lot more comfortable watching your dough instead of the clock. There are a lot of people teaching about proofing and the science behind it. So I recommend doing some of the research, watching some YouTube videos. The sourdough journey is a great one. I have learned so much from him. One of my favorite kind of tweaks to my technique that I learned was tweaking the timing of my pre-shape and my bench rest. So I've learned that I love to pre-shape on the early side long before my dough is ready and give it a really nice long bench rest, sometimes even an hour. The dough gets super relaxed and it's really easy to shape, nice and stretchy and just beautiful, soft, silky dough. Pre-shaping early gives you some flexibility in your schedule and also gives you time to do that long bench rest without worrying about overproofing your dough. You can even do it real early and allow yourself time for your dough to finish proofing in your bannetons. Sometimes I do this if my shaping schedule falls right around like when I need to pick up my kids from school. I'll pre-shape real early, get it all into the bannetons, go pick them up, and then when I get home, it's finished rising at room temperature and I can pop it in the fridge. This is just a great way to help avoid that frantic rush if your dough is absolutely ready and like borderline way overproofed and you're trying to shape it so fast and get it cooled down. This is a technique that a lot of the professional production bakers do in commercial bakeries, just moving that part of the timing earlier, getting it into the bannetons earlier so that it can finish the rest of its rise on the counter to get in the fridge. Which moves us on to refrigeration. One thing I recommend as we start talking about refrigeration is investing in a small thermometer so that you can identify how well your fridge is actually maintaining the temperature. Even if your fridge has a digital temperature gauge on it, that's not always completely reliable. If you're using your home fridge and opening it up fairly often, that can cause the temperature to fluctuate a lot. If it's an older fridge, it may not maintain temperature quite right, or it may have colder and warmer spots. So use an analog thermometer. They're really cheap, and just hang it in there so you can keep track of how well it's actually cooling and staying cool. A couple things to think about with refrigeration. When you are, number one, when you're loading a lot of dough in the fridge, you can expect that temperature of the fridge to rise. Your dough is at room temperature. So if you're putting 10, 12, 30 loaves of bread in your fridge and they're 60 degrees, it's going to take a while for that mass of dough to go from 68 degrees down to 40 or whatever your fridge temperature is. This is something that a lot of people experience. They load all that dough into the fridge, the temperature rises within the fridge, and during that time, when the fridge is working overtime to cool it all down, the dough will overproof. A couple ways that you can help avoid this is to stagger your batches when possible. So if you can mix up in batches of 6, 8, 10 and space them out by 30 minutes or so, that gives you flexibility where you can load your first batch of 10 into your fridge, and then 30 minutes later, you can load your next one. You can do that, space it out, give your fridge a chance to catch up so you're not just loading a huge amount of 68-degree dough. Another thing you can do is add some ice packs on the top shelf of the fridge to help it cool down faster if you need to. I recommend putting them up top since cold air falls rather than putting them down on the bottom. It's just another way to introduce some extra cold in there and help drop the temperature faster. Now, one thing I see really often, and I experience this myself, is the advice to cover your bannetons with plastic or with plastic bags. And then I see pictures all the time of people with their fridge full of dough and just completely overflowing, completely overproofed, but covered with plastic. And that's because the plastic is going to trap heat and prevent your dough from cooling down quickly enough. So it's just going to dramatically overproof. So it's okay to leave your bannetons uncovered, especially if you have a dedicated fridge where you don't have other like family food in there that could leach smells. If you're using plastic bowls that don't breathe, definitely make sure to leave those uncovered. Don't put a sealed lid on there that's going to trap all the heat inside. This is again part of the learning curve. I've experienced it. So many of us have, but maybe listening to this will help some of you skip this part of the learning curve and not have a complete overflowing mess of dough in your fridge. I see a lot of people ask about leaving your dough uncovered, and the general advice is don't worry about it drying out. It usually doesn't dry out too badly unless if it's sitting in there for multiple days. And the dried out surface is going to become the bottom of your loaf anyway. When you flip it out of the banneton to bake, that's going to become the bottom. And so if it's a little bit dry, that really is not going to adversely affect your bread. You can mix it with a little bit of water to soften it up if you want to, but professional bakers all leave their dough uncovered and it works out beautifully. Especially if you have a dedicated dough fridge and you're putting a bunch of dough in there, the humidity of that bread dough, in my experience, helps prevent a lot of the drying also. I will say investing in a dedicated dough fridge, if that's not something that you have already, is a great thing to have on your radar as one of the earliest investments that you can make. I've talked about this previously, but I started out by buying an inexpensive used upright freezer off of Facebook Marketplace. I spent $250 on it, and then I used a $50 Inkbird temperature controller to run it as a fridge. I did that for well over a year until I just recently upgraded to a new fridge. Having a dedicated dough fridge is absolutely a game changer if you see yourself scaling your business beyond just a few loaves in your family fridge. If you're ready to invest in a brand new fridge rather than a used one, looking for one that is convertible from fridge to freezer is a great idea. A lot of times when I'm loading my dough, I I convert my fridge to a freezer for about half an hour to 45 minutes to drop the temperature dramatically, and that's another great way to prevent overproofing. And then you just have to make sure to set a reminder on your phone or something to flip it back to fridge so you don't freeze your bread. The final part of this conversation about baking in bulk is baking. So there are a lot of options for baking multiple loaves at once. Most commonly, people start baking in Dutch ovens, and that tends to be limiting. Most people can't bake more than 3 or 4 loaves at a time in their conventional oven. It just is too tight to fit more Dutch ovens in that. I also found that just the shuffle of the heavy Dutch ovens wore me out really fast. So I very quickly looked for a way to bake more efficiently. So one method that I've seen people use is roasting pans, the lightweight enamel roasters that you use for roasting meat. They work great for bread. They have a cover to trap the steam in, and they're much lighter weight. If you have a gas oven and can't open bake and you need a way to keep steam in, enamel roasting pans are a great thing to explore. The other really common option that has transformed things for a lot of people is the 2 loaf pan method. This is very similar where you just bake in a loaf pan. You can bake any bread recipe just in your loaf pan and then cover it with a second loaf pan to trap your steam in there for the first part of your bake, and then you remove that second loaf pan to brown your bread to finish baking. This is a great option if you're okay with losing out on the rustic batard shape. It can be a great way to bake a lot more bread at a time without the limitation of having to use Dutch ovens or open bake. And so the final option is open baking on a steel. This is the route I went. I just really love the rustic look of an oval loaf, and I didn't want to lose that personally. So for me, I chose to learn to open bake. I do have an electric oven, and so I was able to figure out the steam and could bake 4 loaves at a time in my residential oven. And that was a great way to start to scale up. And then after a bit, upgraded to a residential double oven, which allows me to bake a lot more all at once. Again, like I said at the beginning, there are as many ways to bake as there are bakers. So what I share is not the only way to do it. There are so many different options. So find what serves you best, what works with your goals. But if you need a deeper dive or have more questions about what I've shared here, feel free to send me a message on Instagram and let me know what you need more help on. I can look for guest experts. I could do another episode and help serve you with a deeper dive. As you're learning, just remember practice makes perfect. If you end up with overproofed bread, do not sweat it. It's still yummy. I tell my workshop participants ugly breads taste good too. Don't get caught up trying to make it beautiful. Just really work on making it consistent. With overproof bread, you can make croutons, you can make breadcrumbs, you can make bread pudding, you can salvage it, you can still eat it. It's all part of the learning curve. I hope this has been helpful and answered a few questions for you, maybe helped you skip some of the learning curve and learn from the mistakes that myself and other bakers have already made. As always, if you're not following the show yet, make sure you do that. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a new episode. And if you have a moment to leave a review of the show, that would mean the world. That helps the show grow and be found by more and more bakers who are building a business that complements their lives and helps them grow and thrive and serve their family and their community. I will be back very soon with another episode. But until then, happy baking.